The letter from Conrad Weld described a well-established cattle operation in the Powder River Basin. It mentioned a sturdy ranch house, reliable water from a creek that ran year-round, and a position of some standing in the community of Durant, Wyoming. It did not mention that the well-established operation was hemorrhaging money, since the hard winter of 1887 killed half his herd. The sturdy ranch house had a roof that leaked in 3 places when it rained and 4 when it snowed. The position of some standing consisted of a reputation for being the man least likely to ask for help and most likely to need it. The letter from Nell Archer described a capable woman of practical disposition, experienced in the management of a working household, comfortable with the demands of rural life, and unbothered by hard work. It did not mention that Nell had spent the last 11 years running the front desk of her brother-in-law's dry goods store in Cheyenne. That her experience with rural life consisted of one summer on her uncle's farm, when she was 14. And that her idea of hard work was inventory day in November when the ledger columns refused to balance. They were both optimists. They were both desperate. They were both in their own particular way, lying through their teeth. I've thought about Conrad Weld and Nell Archer for a long time now. I heard their story from a woman in Durant who had known them both, and what she told me stayed with me the way certain stories do. Not because they ended the way you hoped, but because they ended the way they deserved to. Which is rarer than it sounds. Conrad Weld was 41 years old. Built like a man who had been arguing with the Wyoming wind for 2 decades and was losing on points but refusing to quit. He had come to the Powder River Basin from Ohio in 1873 with $300, a second-hand saddle, and the particular brand of stubbornness that the frontier either rewarded or killed, depending on the year. By 1889 he had 640 acres of deeded land, a small herd rebuilt after the die-up, a bunkhouse with 2 hands who had stayed loyal through lean times, and a silence in the main house that had become so familiar. He no longer noticed it until he was in town and heard other men talk about their wives and felt the absence like a missing tooth his tongue kept finding. He was not lonely. He told himself this regularly. He was efficient. A wife was a practical consideration, the same as a new well pump or a second barn, something the operation required to function properly at the next stage. He needed someone who could manage the house, put up food for winter, keep the accounts straight, and handle the domestic side of things while he handled the cattle. Love was not part of the calculation. Love was for men who had time for it. He wrote to the matrimonial agency in Denver in February of 1889. He was specific in his requirements. He wanted a woman who was capable, unsentimental, and honest about what she was coming to. He thought he was being practical. He was. He was also, though he would not have used this word, afraid. Afraid that if he asked for warmth or companionship, he would seem weak. And the frontier had no patience for weakness. And so he had learned over 20 years to want only what he could justify wanting. Nell Archer was 36 years old, and she had been sensible her entire life. This was what everyone said about her. Sensible Nell, practical Nell. Nell who keeps the book straight and doesn't fuss. She had watched her younger sister marry a man with prospects, and a pleasant laugh and a dry goods store in Cheyenne. And she had been genuinely glad for her sister and genuinely useful to the enterprise, and she had told herself for 11 years that this was enough and had almost believed it. What changed in the winter of 1888 was not dramatic. There was no single moment, no crisis. It was a Tuesday in December when she was closing the store, and she caught her reflection in the dark window glass and did not recognize herself for a moment. Not because she had changed, but because she had not. She looked exactly as she had looked at 25. And she understood, standing there in the cold blue dark of a December evening, that she had been so careful not to want things she couldn't have, that she had stopped wanting things altogether. The agency in Denver seemed, in the cold light of January, like either the bravest or the most ridiculous thing she had ever considered. She considered it for 3 weeks. Then she wrote the letter. She described herself accurately in one sense. She was capable, she was practical, she was not given to complaining. She described herself inaccurately in every specific. The household management was theoretical. The rural experience was minimal. And the phrase comfortable with the demands of rural life was the kind of sentence that sounds honest until someone asks you to prove it. She arrived in Durant on the westbound in late April of 1889, when the Wyoming spring was doing what Wyoming spring does. Pretending to be warm for 3 days in a row and then delivering 6 inches of wet snow to remind you who was in charge. Conrad was waiting at the depot. He was wearing a coat that had been good in 1881, and was now a matter of habit rather than warmth. He held his hat in his hands because he thought it was polite. His first thought, when she stepped off the train, was that she walked like a woman who knew where she was going. His second thought was that where she was going appeared to be somewhere other than here, based on the expression she was wearing. His third thought was that she was sharper looking than he had expected, with the kind of face that didn't arrange itself into pleasantries automatically, and that he found this more reassuring than not. Nell's first thought when she saw Conrad Weld standing on the platform was that he looked like a man who had forgotten what he looked like to other people. Her second thought was that the town of Durant was smaller than the agency's description had implied. Her third thought, when he said Miss Archer in a voice like gravel shifting in a tin pail, was that this was going to be harder than she had allowed herself to imagine. On the drive out to the ranch, he told her about the operation. Cattle numbers, acreage, water rights, the quality of the graze in wet years versus dry. He spoke the way a man speaks when he's been alone long enough that conversation has become a report rather than an exchange. She listened and watched the country open up around her. The sage flats running to the foothills, the sky enormous and indifferent, a hawk tilting on a column of air above a draw. And she kept her face arranged in the expression of a woman who had expected exactly this. She had not expected exactly this. The ranch house was 2 stories, which she hadn't anticipated, and the creek behind it ran clear and cold over smooth stones, which was genuinely beautiful. The roof, she would discover that first night during a brief April rain, was optimistic in 2 of its 3 sections. The kitchen had a good iron stove, heavy and reliable, which was the best thing in the room. The worst thing in the room was that the kitchen was the room where it was most apparent that a man had been living alone for a long time. Not dirty, exactly, but without any of the arrangements that make a space comfortable rather than merely functional. Everything was where it was because it had been put there once, and no one had thought about it since. Conrad showed her the house with the efficiency of a man showing someone the operating instructions for a piece of equipment. Here is the stove. Here is the pantry. Here is where the water comes in. She thanked him. He nodded. He went back to the barn. That first evening she cooked supper from what was in the pantry. She had read a cookbook 3 times on the train, and had selected 2 recipes that seemed uncomplicated. The biscuits came out flat and dense, with a texture that suggested more of a construction material than a food. The beef stew was technically a stew in the sense that it contained beef and liquid in the same pot, though the ratio and the timing had produced something that was closer to beef-flavored water with some gray matter floating in it. Conrad ate it, all of it. He said, "Thank you for supper," and she watched him very carefully to see if he was being sarcastic, and could not determine that he was. He washed his own bowl and spoon, set them on the shelf and said good night. He slept in the small room off the back hall. She had the upstairs room. She lay in the narrow bed listening to the wind work at the eaves, and thought about what she had done with her life. She did not regret it. That surprised her. She thought she would lie there and add up everything she had given up. The store, her sister, the small comforts of a life she knew, and feel the full weight of the mistake. Instead, what she felt was something closer to attention. Like the part of her that had gone quiet in December, had decided to start listening again. What Conrad did not know, sitting in the barn that first evening pretending to check the harness he had already checked that morning, was that Nell Archer was the first person who had sat at his table in 4 months, who was not one of his 2 ranch hands. He did not know what to do with that. He was good at knowing what to do. He was good at reading weather and reading cattle, and reading the creek level in July when the water ran low. He had not been good at people for long enough that he had reclassified people as something he didn't need to be good at. The next morning she was up before him. He came into the kitchen at 5 to find her standing in front of the stove with a look of such focused concentration that he stopped in the doorway. She had the cookbook open on the table. She had flour on her left sleeve. She was staring at the stove as if trying to determine its intentions. She heard him and turned. She said, "I should tell you that I may have overstated my cooking experience." He said, "I noticed." She said, "I can learn it. I learn things quickly, but I need someone to show me how this particular stove behaves because I believe it has opinions." He almost smiled. He didn't, quite. He said, "It runs hot on the left side. If you don't compensate, everything burns on the bottom before it's done in the middle." She said, "That explains yesterday's biscuits." He said yesterday's biscuits had more problems than that. She looked at him. He looked at her. It was the first honest thing either of them had said to the other, and they both felt it, though neither of them would have called it that. He showed her how the stove worked. He did it the way he did everything. Economically, without embellishment. Demonstrating rather than explaining. She watched with the particular attention of someone who was not going to ask twice. By the 3rd morning the biscuits were edible. By the end of the 1st week they were good. He didn't say so, but he stopped eating them with the careful expression of a man preparing himself for disappointment, and she noticed. What came next was harder than the cooking. Living in close quarters with a person who communicates primarily through the quality of his silences, requires a kind of translation that Nell had not anticipated. Conrad Weld did not talk about what he was thinking. He did not talk much about anything. He reported facts, the price of cattle at the Durant market, the condition of the south fence line, what the weather was likely to do. And he made decisions, and he carried them out, and he went to sleep and woke up and did it again. Nell, who had spent 11 years managing transactions and conversations and the intricate social machinery of a retail business, found this as disorienting as the altitude. She tried in those first weeks to draw him out. She asked questions at supper. He answered them. Short, accurate answers that closed the subject rather than opening it. She mentioned things she had read, things she had observed during the day, things she found curious about the country or the cattle, or the particular sky over the Powder River Basin, which was unlike any sky she had seen anywhere. He listened. He sometimes said something brief and precise in response. He never said anything that suggested he wanted her to keep talking. She stopped trying after 3 weeks. She had learned by then that silence did not mean disapproval. And she had begun to find a certain relief in it. The relief of not being required to perform sociability, which she had been performing in one form or another since she was old enough to stand behind a counter and say good morning to strangers. In the quiet of the ranch, she found that she had things to think about. She had not had time to think, really think. In years she also found that she was better at this life than she had expected. Not the cooking at first, though she was improving the other things. She had a good eye for what needed doing, and the disposition to do it without waiting to be asked. She reorganized the pantry and found 3 months' worth of supplies they didn't know they had. She noticed that the bunkhouse stovepipe was drawing badly and mentioned it to Conrad, who looked at it and discovered a blockage that would have been a fire before winter. She rode out with him one afternoon to check on a section of fence, and he let her help string the wire, and she did it without complaint and without making a production of it, and she saw something shift very slightly in the way he looked at her. She did not understand yet that she was being evaluated, that every day was a kind of test she hadn't been told about, and that she was passing it, not by being what he had asked for, but by being something he hadn't known to ask for. The thing that cracked the surface was not dramatic. It was a Thursday in June, 3 weeks after Nell arrived. Conrad came in for the noon meal and found her at the kitchen table with the ranch's account ledger open in front of her, and a look on her face that he recognized from his own experience as the look of a person who has found something wrong. She said, "Your accounts." He said, "What about them?" She said, "You're being overcharged by the feed supplier in Durant. Not by accident either. Look." She turned the ledger toward him and showed him, not the conclusion, she showed him the entries, 3 years of them, the pattern of small discrepancies that added up, over time, to something that was not small at all. Conrad sat down. He looked at the ledger. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "How did you find that?" She said, "I keep books, or I did. It's what I'm good at." He said, "You worked in a store," she said. "I ran the accounts for my brother-in-law's store for 11 years. I noticed your ledger was on the shelf with the seed catalog and I thought I might look." He said nothing for what felt like a considerable time. Then he said, "I've been overpaying that man since 1886. She said, $340, give or take. He said, "That's..." He stopped. She said, "I know." $340 was not nothing to a man who had rebuilt his herd after the hard winter, and was still working his way back to solid ground. It was a month's worth of the silence he had been keeping, of the worry he had been carrying alone because there was no one to share it with. He looked at Nell Archer sitting at his kitchen table with his account ledger, and he felt something happen that he had no good word for. Not gratitude exactly, though it was partly that. More like the sensation of a load shifting, redistributing, becoming easier to carry because someone else had put their shoulder to it. He said, "You can keep the books, if you want to." She said, "I was going to whether you asked me or not." The summer moved the way Wyoming summers do, fast and hot and bright, with the work coming in waves that peaked during haying and didn't ease until the cattle were on fall grass. Nell worked alongside the rhythm of it. She learned the kitchen well enough that by July she was cooking for the 2 hands as well, and the one named Doyle, who had been with Conrad since the lean years, told her that the food had got better since she arrived, and she said she hoped so, because it had apparently been dismal. She learned to read the creek level the way Conrad had described it. The color of the water in the shallows, the sound it made against the stones. She learned which of the horses had opinions, and which of the cattle were troublemakers. She learned that the country, which had seemed merely enormous when she arrived, was enormous in the specific way of a thing that is paying attention to you, watching what you do with what it gives you. Conrad during those months said very little. This was not unusual for Conrad, but Nell had learned by midsummer to distinguish between his silences, and the silence he carried in June and July was different from the silence he had carried in May. It was less closed, less a wall and more a room with the door left open. What she did not know was that Conrad Weld, alone in the barn in the evenings, was conducting a conversation with himself that would have alarmed him, had he been able to hear it from the outside. He was thinking about Nell in the way a man thinks about something he is trying not to think about, which is to say, constantly. He was thinking about the way she had showed him the ledger without apology or performance, the way she sat a horse as if she had been doing it all her life even though she hadn't, the way she laughed at the catalog of small disasters that frontier life delivered daily, not the polite laugh of someone managing discomfort, but the real laugh of someone who found the absurdity genuinely funny. He did not know what to do with any of this. He was 41 years old and he had spent 20 years deciding that wanting things was inefficient. He had gotten very good at not wanting things. He was no longer sure he was good at it. The moment that broke it open happened in August on the worst day of that summer, and one of the worst days Conrad Weld had experienced in 20 years of bad and good ones. A grass fire. It started on the East Ridge on a Wednesday afternoon, in a dry wind out of the southwest, and by the time Conrad saw the smoke from the south pasture it was already moving faster than a man could run. He rode hard for the ranch. He sent Doyle in the other hand, a young man named Pratt, to cut a firebreak on the north end. He went for the horses in the corral. Nell had seen the smoke from the kitchen window. She had not waited to be told. By the time Conrad reached the corral she was already there. Not watching from the porch, not asking what to do, but opening the gate and slapping the horses out, one by one, into the clear field to the west, away from the smoke. She was moving fast and without hesitation, and she had already gotten 4 of the 7 horses out, before he arrived. He went to work on the others. She took the 2 that were fighting the smoke and panic, and spoke to them low and steady until they let her lead them out. Her hands were shaking. He saw that. She was shaking and she was doing it anyway, talking to a frightened horse in a voice so level and calm you would have thought she'd done it 100 times. They lost the east fence line and a section of winter hay. They didn't lose the barn, and they didn't lose the horses, and they didn't lose the house. At dusk, standing at the edge of the scorched field watching the last of the smoke go gray against the sky, Conrad looked at Nell. There was ash in her hair. There was a burn on her right forearm where a spark had caught her. Not serious but red and real. She was looking at the blackened grass with an expression he recognized because he had worn it himself. The look of a person calculating what is left after subtraction. He said, "The hay we lost I can buy from the Halverson place. They had a good cut this year." She said, "I know. I saw their field when we drove past on Saturday." He said, "The fence I can rebuild before October," she said. "I can help with that," he said. "The east section goes across broken ground," she said. "I noticed." He said, "Nell." She turned and looked at him. He was not a man who used names easily, and she understood that her name in his mouth meant something different from what it usually meant. He said, "Thank you," just those 2 words. But the way he said them, the whole summer was in them. The ledger and the hay and the fence and the horses and the 100 small things she had done without being asked. And she heard all of it. She said, "I'm not going anywhere." She had not planned to say it. She didn't know until she heard herself that it was true. She had arrived in April as a woman making a practical calculation, somewhere to go, something to be. A life that was hers rather than an appendage of someone else's. She had not planned on this particular life. She had not planned on the creek in June, or the way the basin looked in early morning when the light came sideways across the sage, or the sensation of carrying half of something instead of standing outside it. Conrad looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I was not honest in my cell letter." She said, "Neither was I." He said, "The operation isn't as established as I made it sound." She said, "You're solvent and you're rebuilding. That's more than most." He said, "I'm not." He stopped and tried again. "I am not easy to live with," she said. "I have noticed." He said, "I don't know how to." Another stop. He looked at the scorched ground. He looked at her. He said, "I don't know how to be with someone. It's been a long time." And Nell Archer, who had spent 11 years being sensible and useful and undemanding, who had rearranged herself so efficiently around other people's needs, that she had lost track of her own shape, looked at this man who could fix a fence line in the dark, and hadn't bought himself a new coat since the previous administration, and said something she had never said to anyone. She said, "You've been doing fine." They were married in Durant in October 1889, by the same circuit preacher who had married 2 other couples that month, in the parlor of the hotel because the church was being re-roofed. Nell wore a blue dress she had ordered from Cheyenne. Conrad wore his one good coat and had his hair cut for the first time since spring and stood in front of the preacher, with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. Over the next 25 years they built the Weld operation from 640 acres to just under 1,000. They ran cattle and kept horses, and in the later years added a small apple orchard that Nell had read about in an agricultural pamphlet, and Conrad had called impractical, and then spent 2 summers helping her plant and maintain. The orchard thrived. He never mentioned that he had called it impractical. She never mentioned it either, though she thought about it every September when the apples came in, and she put them up in jars that lined the pantry shelf like a quiet argument she had won. The accounts were always right. Every supplier in Durant learned, after one experience, that the ledger at the Weld Ranch was more reliable than their own records, and that if there was a discrepancy the ledger was correct. Nell became over time a cook of genuine skill, which she attributed to stubbornness rather than talent, and which Conrad attributed to the fact that she applied the same systematic attention to a biscuit recipe that she applied to a balance sheet. She said that was not a compliment. He said it absolutely was. Conrad learned over time to say more, not everything. He was never a man given to easy words, but more. He learned to say thank you and I was wrong and I am glad you're here. which is not a complete vocabulary but is for certain kinds of people in certain kinds of lives more than enough. He built her a proper desk in the second year, in the corner of the front room for the accounts. He was not a skilled carpenter. The desk was level and functional and had one drawer that stuck in humid weather, and one leg that was slightly shorter than the other three, remedied with a folded piece of leather that sat under it for 20 years. It was, Nell said, the most useful thing she owned. He read that as a compliment. She meant it as one. Conrad Weld died in 1916, at the age of 68. He had spent the last years of his life on a ranch that was nothing like the one he had described in a letter to a matrimonial agency in Denver, and better than anything he had thought to want. Nell outlived him by 14 years. She kept the accounts until she was past 70, ran the operation with her son and one of the original hands, and did not sell a single acre. She said once to a neighbor who asked her how she had managed it all. The fire, the hard winters, the work of building something from dry ground up. She said, I arrived not knowing anything, and Conrad was not easy to know. But he was honest about what he was after. He stopped being dishonest about it, and that turned out to be enough. She arrived expecting a gentleman rancher, a man of some standing in a community of substance. He arrived expecting a capable woman who could run a house and stay out of his way. They were both wrong about each other, and wrong about what they needed, and what they built instead. Out of bad biscuits and a crooked desk and a grass fire in August and one sentence on a scorched field as the smoke went gray. Held for 50 years and would have held longer if time had permitted. I've told this story because I think about Conrad and Nell when I see people decide in advance what they need, and find something better than they knew to ask for, and mistake that for failure, instead of recognizing it as the thing itself. Who do you think changed more by the end? Conrad, who learned to open a door he'd kept shut for 20 years, or Nell, who learned she'd wanted a life she hadn't had the words for? Tell me in the comments. I'd like to know.